On behalf of the Office of Public Affairs of the Baha'i Community of Canada, I'd like to welcome you to today's panel, The Climate Crisis and Gender Equality, Reflections on the 66th Session of the United Nations Commission on the Status of Women. I'm delighted to welcome so many of you to celebrate Earth Day, marking the anniversary of the birth of the modern environmental movement. First held in 1970, it is a day where a wide range of events happen globally and include over 1 billion people in more than 193 countries. My name is Laura Friedman, and I will be your moderator today. I work as the media officer for the Office of Public Affairs. I'm also a filmmaker and a mother to 2 wonderful children. So the impact of the pandemic has been far-reaching in all our lives. But one of the blessings of working virtually is that we can gather together from many different places. And I'd like to acknowledge the land on which I stand today, the treaty lands and territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, which is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. I'm grateful to welcome you from this land. As mentioned earlier, today's event is hosted by the Office of Public Affairs, which represents the Baha'i community of Canada on the national stage. This office convenes conversations that are important to our community and to Canada as a whole. And the principle of the equality of women and men is an indispensable element of the Baha'i teachings. In addition, the Baha'i teachings state that humanity is entrusted with the responsibility to care for the planet and to benefit from its resources in a way that is sustainable. So this link between gender equality and our relationship with the natural environment is one that we will explore today. So this year's UN Commission on the Status of Women focused on climate change, the environment, risk reduction, and the ways in which gender equality is at the center of the search for solutions. A number of Canadians participated in this global dialogue about how the full and effective participation of women in decision-making and public life can contribute to processes of sustainable development. A process of social transformation is needed for humanity to adequately respond to climate change. So we're joined today by 3 wonderful guests, and we have a few questions for them. I would like to now introduce Elodie Jacquet, who's Manager of Knowledge and Practice at the SFU Morris J. Wosk Center for Dialogue. We also have Umberto Carollo, Executive Director of White Ribbon Canada and co-chair of the Global Men Engage Alliance. And lastly, my colleague Andrea Salguero, Deputy Director of Government Relations of the Office of Public Affairs of the Baha'i Community of Canada. So thank you so much for being here with us today. We're very happy that you've joined. So the questions that we would like to explore today are, why is the meaningful participation of women in all aspects of society essential to this process? How can existing relationships of dominance and power that lead to the exploitation of both women and the Earth's resources be transformed to relationships that are founded on mutual aid and reciprocity? So now I'd like to invite each of our panelists to share their thoughts for a few minutes, and we'll just go around, and then we will have time and space for Q&A, and we might ask a few other questions. There is a Q&A in the chat. And so I'll start with Elodie. Would you like to start? Yeah, please, could you kick us off, Elodie?
Thank you very much, Laura. And thank you for the Baha'i community for welcoming us today. I feel very honored to spend this morning with you. I wanted to start by sharing a few images very quickly. These are women from around the world. You'll see on the top, there are women from Bangladesh after the terrible floods that happened in Bangladesh in 2016. Also on the top are women in Ghana who are trying to salvage what they can from crops to feed their families after terrible droughts that happen there. And on the bottom part, much closer to where I live, are women from the city of Lytton that was burnt to the ground during the forest fires last year, and a woman trying to assess the damage to her home in Abbotsford after the major floods that also happened as a consequence of climate change last year. And the reason why I wanted to share these images is so that we can humanize the face of climate change and remember that these women could be us. They could be our neighbors, they could be our sisters, they could be our mothers. And it's a teaching that I've taken from elders here on the territory that I stand on. I'm very blessed to be a guest on the lands of the Coast Salish people, the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh peoples. And they teach us that we have a shared responsibility to fostering relationships between one another and to taking care of the earth. And in a sense, there is a spiritual price to pay if we fail to look at climate and our relationships with one another in an equitable way. It is particularly important because women are more likely to be affected by climate change. Women are more likely to live in poverty than men, to have access to basic human rights like the ability to move freely, to acquire land, and they face systemic violence that escalates during periods of instability. These factors and many more mean that as climate change intensifies, women will struggle the most. The IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change, found that gender inequalities are further exaggerated by climate-related hazards, and they result in higher workloads for women, occupational hazards indoors and outdoors, psychological and emotional stress, and higher mortality compared to men. In fact, the Paris Agreement includes specific provisions to ensure women receive supports to cope with the hazards of climate change. And when women find themselves at the intersections of other oppressions, if they are Indigenous, women of color, have a disability, their risks are further compounded. Gender inequality hampers women's capacity and potential to be actors of climate action. These gender inequalities, access to and control over resources, access to education and information, and equal rights and access to decision-making processes define what women and men can and cannot do in the particular context of climate change. This is why we need to rethink dramatically how women access decision-making circles and participate in climate discussions. This recent Commission on the Status of Women that just took place reaffirmed the urgency to eliminate these persistent historic and structural inequalities: racism, stigmatization, xenophobia, unequal power relations between men and women, discriminatory laws and policies, negative social norms and gender stereotypes, and of course, the unequal sharing of unpaid care and domestic work, protection systems and public services, including health services and quality education, so that we can realize gender equity and the empowerment of all women and girls, including in the context of climate change, environmental and disaster risk reduction policies and programs. It's a pretty tall order, but I think for any person of faith, whatever that faith is, we are left with the challenge to call for justice and equity. And I know these are important tenets of the Baha'i faith as well. Justice scholars really talk to us about three dimensions in particular of justice: distributive justice, procedural justice, and justice as recognition. Distributive justice is about ensuring an equitable distribution of resources and opportunities. Procedural justice is about ensuring all voices are included in decision-making. And justice as recognition is about acknowledging and repairing past injustices, all things that are important to people of faith all around the world. So I will speak briefly about procedural justice in the climate context, which is what I work on. I was actually recently at the COP26 in Glasgow with other academics and scholars. And while there were substantial efforts made to ensure gender equity on most of the panel presentations at the conference, a few major ones ended up being, and I quote the words of the former UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Mary Robinson, "Too male, too pale, too stale." What does that tell us? That to truly tackle a complex issue as climate change, We need new innovative thinking, and it won't likely come if we don't have gender equity. We need to make sure women's voices are at those tables, whether they're decision-making tables, labor organizing tables, tables on health provision, on academic research, on community engagement and organization, and of course, in faith groups. The Commission for the Status of Women that took place acknowledges the important role that women and girls play as agents of change, particularly when it comes to safeguarding the environment. It reiterates the importance of mainstreaming the gender perspective in disaster risk management and recognizes the need for inclusive participation and contributions of all women. So how do we achieve that? It's a tall order. I think we actually need to rethink spaces, particularly when it comes to decision making and consultation, so that they are shared and geared to allow better participation from women. I don't know if any of you have ever been part of any consultation process in Canada or elsewhere, but often these are done at times where women who are often more burdened with child or elder care cannot participate because the time coincides with school pickup or other duties they have. But one thing that COVID has taught us is that we can employ different means to engage people and create more inclusive environments for public participation, including by using virtual tools such as this platform we're using today. And we know that the use of these virtual platforms has enabled other people to participate as well, people with disabilities who often couldn't come into spaces to have their voices heard. And I want to give a few examples of what we mean by more active public participation. I work in Indonesia a lot, and recently a whole group of urban women were effectively engaged to develop strategies to encourage active transportation, like biking for women, in ways that felt safe for them. Women in Indonesia and in the Solomon Islands were also actively participating in climate risk assessments in their communities and neighborhoods. And the data they provided is essential to risk management and mitigation. This data would have been incomplete without the perspectives the women brought. This engagement process was completely designed and led by women and is now considered a really innovative process. What that tells us is that having women's voices actively engaged in climate discussions, consultations, research, and decision-making is really essential to finding pathways to solutions that reinforce resilience and create safer communities for all. The Commission on the Status of Women recognizes that women often take the lead in promoting an environmental ethic, reducing resource use, reusing and recycling resources to minimize waste and excessive consumption. The Commission on the Status of Women recognizes, in fact, that women's full, equal, and meaningful participation and leadership in multilateral, national, and local policy processes are vital for achieving sustainable development and climate, environmental, and disaster risk reduction goals. There are really a myriad of ways in which women can be brought into these spaces of decision-making, and it's all a matter of will and imagination. What we're facing right now is actually a deficit of imagination when it comes to climate engagement. And what we need is to reignite this imagination, something that can be achieved when women's voices are finally seen as equally valuable. So I want to encourage people to think about those creative ways in which they can foster spaces for women to more meaningfully participate in climate decision-making. It can start small, at a community level, in faith groups, in neighborhoods, in schools. All of us have levers of power that we can pull and activate, and we all have an ability to create space for others to have a voice. Sometimes it takes a little bit of courage. And I like to point out to some courageous men in boardrooms and at tables who have refused to be on panels if there were no women represented or any other voices of diversity. What we need to think is of justice in these three dimensions. Are we also compensating women in appropriate ways? Are we providing equal opportunities for schooling, access to adequate supports for childcare and elder care? Are we enabling financial literacy and independence? Tackling climate change is going to take a huge amount of courage and boldness from us all. women are often the ones who lead the charge when it comes to moral courage. And their courage often comes out of necessity. We all have children that we need to think about, and we often think about the next generations and how we need to sustain an environment for them. So let's think about those ways in which we can support that courage at all levels and ensure that courage is not stifled by fear. What we have is a battle for hope and unity ahead of us. So I want to thank you very much for the opportunity to share today, and I'm really looking forward to discussions with the other panelists.
Thank you so much, Elodie. And thanks for inviting us to take a closer look at justice and equity and the importance of bringing women to the table and taking into consideration the needs that women might have for participating in decision-making spaces and how vital it is. I love what you said about the need for us to reignite our imagination and find creative ways to invite participation. So next I'll invite Humberto to share his thoughts.
Thank you so much, Laura. Thank you so much, Baha'i Communities of Canada, for bringing us together. And thank you so much, Elodie, for those amazing insights. I think it's going to be difficult for me to follow on after your presentation, but I'll do my best. And, you know, I must confess with all of you that climate justice is not a specialty of mine. I come from the engaging men and boys in gender equality and preventing gender-based violence field. That's the work that I do day in and day out. But I also am strongly committed to think through intersectionality and think through opportunities to strengthen allyship across social movements. And recognizing that for too long, our movements have worked often in isolation. And I know, because I recognize that in my own area of work in terms of addressing gender equality and preventing gender-based violence, in that increasingly we must work together, we must collaborate, we must understand, seek to understand these intersectionalities and seek to understand the disproportionate impact of oppression, including climate injustice, on the lives of those most impacted and often those most at the margins. So I'm really proud and thankful for the opportunity to be part of this dialogue. And I'm really humbled to be part of an expert panel who brings that expertise. And I hope that I can share some insights in terms of thinking through the root causes of this problem, thinking through how men and boys in particular can step up, can strengthen their solidarity, their allyship, can do their own self-change work, their collective work, and advocate together for a systemic change, because that's needed. Gender equality is not just a women's issue, it's an issue for all of us to deal with. It is a human rights issue, and so is climate justice. So as we have these conversations, we need to include a stronger gender-based analysis and lenses to our conversations, to our solutions, to our resolve to understand the root causes of this issue. So let me share some insights with you. And again, I draw on the amazing, courageous, expert work of feminist organizations and climate justice activists in helping me support my own understanding of the issues and the insights and the calls to action that I share with you. Recently, I had an opportunity to moderate a panel at CSW on behalf of UNESCO, and that panel focused on women, youth at the front lines of the climate change response, and it included representatives from the permanent delegations of Montenegro and Iceland, representatives from UN Women, and also members of the UNESCO Youth Climate Action Network and the Men Engage Alliance. So I thank them for their contributions, and I will root some of my insights and calls to action on what they shared during that panel as well. So we know that climate change is one of the most urgent global challenges facing the world. That is without a doubt, and we see so many examples of the impact of that crisis right now in the global south, in South Africa, with the floods and the landslides, the loss of life, and in so many other regions of the world, including here in Canada, as Elodie powerfully demonstrated through her pictures. For long, feminist and climate activists, Indigenous people, and youth climate movements have been challenging dominant, patriarchal, socioeconomic, and political systems perpetrating climate change. We need to support their calls to action and transformation. The causes and the threats of climate change are not gender neutral. Climate change and environmental degradation disproportionately impact the lives of women, girls, and people of diverse gender identities. Communities who live at the intersections of multiple forms of oppression and marginalization in the global south are particularly impacted. Climate change is rooted in histories of colonial resource extraction and patriarchal hegemonic structures of power and dominance. The global pandemic, COVID-19 pandemic, has only exacerbated the existing levels of inequality and access to care all over the world. So it essentially has added to the existing climate crisis. We have seen increasing levels of femicides and gender-based violence against women, girls, and individuals of diverse gender identities. We witness a surge in militarism and authoritarian governments around the world, with escalating use of repressive tactics of social control and armed violence against minorities as a means to consolidate regimes. These forms of power over people and planet are well-funded and inclusive of anti-rights movements that systematically attack gender equality, women's rights, the rights of LGBTQI people, and racial and climate justice. All the while, a failure of transformative climate action continues. We need to better understand how harmful ideas of manhood, how masculinities that include the need to have power over others, destroy livelihoods and perpetuate environmental degradation. We must further explore and unpack these root causes of the climate crisis. Doing so, we'll be able to help strengthen future and existing solutions for climate change adaptation and resilience by exposing the harms of patriarchal masculinities and working with men and boys as allies to transform power structures along feminist, indigenous, and youth climate movements. Through intersectional feminist approaches that are accountable to our planet and to all women, girls, and gender non-conforming individuals and marginalized groups, we need to center our work on human rights-based and gender transformative practices. And allow me to say a few words to conclude in relation to the role of faith leaders and the role of faith institutions in this. Given that all over the world, many men, in fact, most leadership positions in faith institutions are occupied by men. And given the historical role of faith and religion and institutions in perpetrating violence, exclusion, genocide, and climate injustice as well, it's important that faith institutions and faith leaders consider in particular the role that they can play, and that must begin with righting historical wrongs and participating in practices, in processes that lead to the reparation of those harms, to the balance of justice and inclusion, to apologizing for past harms, and to repairing relationships with communities, individuals, societies that have been historically excluded from these institutions. So change is needed at an individual level, it is needed at a collective level, and it is needed at a systemic level when it comes to faith institutions. And then after doing that, faith leaders and faith groups have an important role to play, and how the Baha'i community here in Canada has come together and organized this event is a perfect example of what can be done. Faith leaders and faith institutions have the power, the ability to engage their constituencies, their congregations, their communities in dialogue, in awareness raising, in changing around harmful norms that lead to continue to oppress people, continue to denigrate lands and the environment. It's a strong platform for change. And just as religion has stood for peace, for justice, it can extend those principles to promoting equality, full inclusion, to repairing past wrongs, and to helping us proceed in a path that is just and inclusive for all. So in all, we need to join efforts across social movements and join in transformative calls to action for change, equity, full inclusion, and sustainability. And I call on all men and boys to be part of this solution, to do their part as individuals, as collective members, as leaders, as agents of change. And I am here to support that. And so is White Ribbon, the Global Men Engaged Alliance, and our collective community of activists and advocates that are working to end gender-based violence and promoting gender equality. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Humberto, for inviting us to have look closer and have a deeper understanding of the intersectional aspects of this work and the oppressive forces that surround us. And it's very true, as you said, that climate justice and gender equity is a human rights issues, and that the need to explore the root of the climate crisis, we need to expose these patriarchal and colonial systems. And your work with men and boys and working alongside women to advocate for systemic changes is really inspiring. So I'd like to now invite my colleague Andrea for her remarks.
Hi. Thank you, Laura, and thank you so much, Elodie and Humberto, for your comments and your rich perspective. I'm so happy to be able to share some of what was learned at CSW with everyone here today. And along with Laura, I was fortunate to attend the virtual CSW this year as part of the Baha'i International Community Delegation. And the Baha'i International Community follows a discourse on the equality of women and men very closely, as does the Baha'i community of Canada. And in my remarks today, I thought I would begin by sharing some of the recurring themes to emerge from CSW regarding the intersection of gender equality and climate change, before moving to address the two questions framing this event. So, as some of you may know, the priority theme at CSW this year was achieving gender equality and the empowerment of all women and girls in the context of climate change, environmental and disaster risk reduction policies and programs. And participants were also invited to reflect on women's economic empowerment in the changing world of work. And in response to these themes, state and NGO representatives frequently shared that while women are disproportionately affected by the effects of climate change, they must not be seen as victims and have a great role to play in any envisioned solution to the climate crisis. At the same time, the importance of recognizing the intersectionality of women's experience was highlighted through the acknowledgement that some women will suffer the negative effects of climate change much more than others. For example, Indigenous women and women living in rural areas, as Elodie mentioned. It was also shared that women continue to face numerous barriers that impede their full participation in society, and in areas relating to climate change as in other matters. For example, the impact of the pandemic on the work environment revealed that women in Canada and around the world still undertake a disproportionate amount of care duties in the home, regularly looking after children, the elderly, and the infirm. And in the workplace, women are also more likely to face a wage gap vis-a-vis men in the same position and face barriers in being considered for leadership roles in work and community life. And of great global concern at CSW was what was referred to as the shadow pandemic of domestic violence that is harming women and girls around the world. And it was also emphasized that the COVID-19 pandemic, ongoing conflicts, and climate-related disasters all compound to actually exacerbate the violence that women were already experiencing. So in the face of these crises, several panelists at CSW put forward the idea that the barriers to women's participation in society, including the most egregious acts of violence against women, and the climate crisis are not separate issues. Rather, the exploitation of women and the exploitation of the Earth's resources can be seen as symptoms of an underlying culture that has given precedence to a certain way of thinking, a certain mode of operating. And these relationships of inequality, domination, and power operating in society lead us to exploit the environment are the same relationships that lead to the subjugation of women. And a powerful example of this was shared in one panel, noted that in Canada, the construction sites that accompany the expansion of pipelines and other extractive industry infrastructure, informally known as man camps, are often accompanied by a notable rise in violence against women, and particularly Indigenous women around these camp settlements. As one environmentalist, Kristen Tully of Entre Missions, mentioned in her remarks, some of the prevalent modes of thinking in society that lead to this exploitation are, and I'm quoting her remarks here, we take resources for granted. We often try to improve our own conditions without paying attention to the problems we're creating for others. And we place the most value on what we can extract, control, and own. So this brings me to the first question before the panel, which asked us to consider, why is the meaningful participation of women so important to adequate responses to climate change? And at CSW, one reason that came up was because of the unique role of women in families and in communities. Participants highlighted women's special role as mothers, as primary educators of the next generation, and primary educators regarding sustainable practices. Women are also the primary decision makers in their household regarding what is consumed in the home, and they set the pattern for family life. In many communities, women also hold special roles as historical nurturers and healers in their communities, in addition to the multiple other professional roles women hold in all areas of society. Another reason women's participation is essential is due to the positive impact we can observe that results from the participation of women. To offer a few examples here, in the area of governance, parliaments with gender parity tend to adopt more sustainable state practices. In conflict areas, peace processes involving women result in a more lasting and sustainable peace. And in business, the inclusion of women in all levels of a business's operation leads to the adoption of more sustainable practices, as well as greater profitability for the business. So with this understanding that the participation of women is essential, this brings us to the second question before this panel, which is how can the existing relationships of dominance and power that lead to the exploitation of both women and the Earth's resources be transformed to relationships founded on mutual aid and reciprocity? And in response to this question, I thought I would highlight some of the contributions from religious and spiritual perspectives that were shared at CSW as one additional lens through which we can understand and approach the climate crisis and gender equality. One insight from spirituality points to the fundamental interconnectedness or oneness of the Earth and its peoples. From this perspective, we understand that the Earth is a home to all the world's peoples, that what happens at the grassroots is not separate from what happens at the international level, and that any physical or conceptual delimitations made to privilege one part of the world or people over another are superficial and illusory. Our true spiritual reality is that of an undeniably interlinked, interconnected Earth we are called to care for as stewards. And from this view, any approach or solution to address climate change, therefore, must recognize this profound interconnectedness. Any solution that ignores this dimension of reality could end up causing more harm than good, even if well-intentioned. For example, we can imagine solutions that seek to insulate a part of the world from the more severe impacts of climate change through advanced technological solutions, for example, such as investing in infrastructure while leaving others to suffer in different parts of the world. Another insight from religious and spiritual teachings we can draw on to understand this transformation of relationships is the perspective that as human beings, we have a rich inner life that exerts an influence on the world around us in the same way that the environment exerts an influence on us. And this perspective mirrors a principle of environmentalism, which recognizes that individuals are both shape and are shaped by their environments. And this perspective perhaps goes a step further to recognize that our inner thoughts, beliefs, motivations, and attitudes about the world also exert an influence on the world around us. From this perspective, addressing climate change will require a profound change in mindset, as well as a collective change of heart. This perspective is accompanied by the view that human beings' noblest sentiments of love, compassion, care, and humility can in fact be nurtured to replace the signs of greed and domination and prejudice that lead to these systems founded on exploitation or that result in the rampant materialism we observe around us. In this regard, education is key, an education that helps us embrace our highest capacity to act for the welfare of others and all life on this planet, as well as an education that provides us with the language to be able to describe these subtleties of our shared human experience and to be able to articulate the types of relationships and the type of world we want to see. Another practical step, in addition to promoting dialogue, is to think about creating spaces at the grassroots and at all levels of society where men and women can work shoulder to shoulder in addressing the many issues affecting the world, and together discover new ways of relating to each other. So on that note, I think I will end there. And thank you so much.
Thank you, Andrea, for the points that you shared about the themes that were present at the commission and this around the world of work and how the pandemic really exacerbated a lot of things, including domestic violence, which are of utmost importance. And thanks for reminding us of this relationship and connection between the ways we treat women and the ways we treat the land, our oneness and the way that we're interconnected, and the relationship that exists within our inner world and outer world. So each of you talked about the importance of including women in decision-making processes. However, we also know that these spaces are structured. We know that the way that these spaces are structured also affects the participation of women. So I wanted to ask you how you think processes of decision-making could be improved to be more about the pursuit of truth and less about the contest for power. If anyone wants to go first, or Humberto, would you like to share your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think, I mean, your question is a complex one, and I would say that starting with centering the experiences, the voices, the guidance of those who are most impacted by this crisis, and that is women and girls, children, that is indigenous peoples, that is people from the global south, people that have been impacted directly by climate crisis and displacements and militarism. So their voices, their experiences, their guidance, their leadership must be centered at these events and processes. And I think when we do that, and when we play a strong role of listening, of wanting to stand in solidarity, wanting to be allies, then we are changing the framing, the approach, the dominance, the power over elements of our existing frameworks. And so when we do that, when we apply a strong intersectional lens to this, I think we will start to see change, and we'll start to see meaningful inclusion and value and sustainability in this change. But if we continue with the current order, then it will take us much longer to see that kind of change and that kind of transformation in these dynamics.
Wonderful, thank you. Elodie?
Thank you. And I think Umberto's made some really important points here around how do we center the voices of those most impacted. But there are two other things that I think are important to think about. One is how institutions are often set up in binaries. And if you look at our parliamentary system, for example, it is often a space of yelling at each other, speaking of each other, not necessarily a space for collaboration and for confronting different worldviews. There is often this tension between different worldviews and an opposition of them, instead of an understanding that two realities may coexist and be just as valid. So my experience of climate is just as valid as somebody else's, although it may be different. But we haven't built, in a sense, the muscle to be able to confront our own realities to that of other people in a respectful and dialogical way. It tends to be a zero-sum game. I need to make my point. I need to win this argument, instead of having a deep listening and being able to see what links us, what is that interconnectedness, what is that relationship between our realities. And I think this is a very feminine, actually, way of doing things. Women tend to be more collaborative. It's been demonstrated by a lot of behavioral researchers. So there is an ability to listen deeply that we need to learn from and bring into institutions, into places of decision making, because that's the only way we will be able to have that contextualization of complex issues. When we look at a complex issue just from one angle, we fail to see the nuances and the diversity and other ideas that may bring solutions. We tend to think about it as, what is the one silver bullet that I can use for this problem, instead of understanding that most complex issues necessitate multiple approaches that happen concurrently. So it's not so much about confronting our views, but bringing them together and exploring together. So that's a muscle we need to stretch. And we need to bring a lot more empathy into our institutions. There is a lack of empathy training for people who work in decision-making circles at all levels. And I think that notion of empathy needs to be built in from the youngest that we teach in kindergarten, all the way up to policymakers, elected officials, and so on. If there is a lack of empathy, we start dehumanizing others, and then we have an inability to understand their perspective. And then we lack that color that we need to make this beautiful painting work. So I would say, yeah, thinking in non-linear ways, in more circular ways, encouraging dialogue and deep listening, and building empathy and understanding that different realities can coexist and are just as valid.
Thank you, Elodie, for your insights. Thank you so much. Andrea, would you like to add anything?
Yes, just briefly. Well, I loved what both Umberto and Elodie just mentioned, and I think what I was going to add was similar to what Elodie was sharing, in that I think if we have a narrow view of participation, we can think that because we see, let's say, a diversity of people on a panel or on a board or in these spaces where decisions are made, we can feel that we have achieved the highest end, let's say. But there's a whole other layer in which the people in those spaces could also reflect on the approaches that were used in the meeting, or they could even identify and analyze the underlying forces that affect those spaces, and to think, is this something that we want to adopt going forward, or do we want to base our the way that we interact on different principles entirely? And I think that that's going to what Elodie was saying. It could be considered more feminine ways of relating, or also we could just imagine an entirely different ethic that's not based on competition, or that's not based on an adversarial process at all. And so I think that when you invite a perspective, a diversity of views, and where you invite discussion on those deeper underlying influences, then we may end up in a system that looks very different to the one we have now in very meaningful ways.
Thank you, Andrea. And thanks to the three of you for answering that. We actually have a Q&A section. So if anybody would like to ask any questions, I have one question that I'll ask the three of you, but feel free to add anything, anyone in the audience. We'll still have time for a few more questions. So this question comes from Janelle Mercier. There is limited domestic data on how environmental degradation and climate change may impact gender-based violence in Canada. Do you have any insights into this? And how can we build up research in this area? Humberto, would you like to, or Elodie, please go ahead.
This is a very critical question, and maybe I can share. Recently, I've been working with the province of BC on their gender-based violence action plan, which follows the national action plan that was developed at a federal level. And part of the developing of this action plan was looking at what existing research do we have. And there are elements of research, but they're often not mainstreamed, or they're not shared in very public ways. But what we know for sure is that when there is environmental degradation, when there are intensified climate risks, so for example, the recent wildfires or the floods, we do see an uptake in gender-based violence, particularly domestic violence. People are being displaced from their homes. They are being disconnected from their communities, which means they are disconnected from systems of support, which means both parties in the violence don't have support. Somebody who may have been held by a community might not have resorted to violence, and somebody who is now victim of violence might have had better supports to be able to exit the violent situation. And then they lose that when there is displacement. And we know this is the case all around the world. Any migrant population that is displaced due to climate, whether it's drought, war, other and insecurities in their area, we see the uptick of violence go up. So there is actually data on that exists. It may not be completely mainstreamed. I think there is still more work to do. The National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women actually commissioned research on the man camps that Andrea was talking about, around areas of exploitation of resources. And similarly, there is great data on that. So we do know that the violence goes up, particularly against Indigenous women. We also know it goes up against children. Children get more affected by violence in these areas. This data also mirrors data that has been discovered in the US in the similar circumstances in the Bakken oil fields. So there is some ongoing research there. We also know that there is a parallel with what we call environmental racism. So we know in Canada, certain areas have been subjected to environmental racism. So people in areas where there's a lot of chemical production will then have more risks to their health, etc. Those tend to be communities that are already marginalized or underserved. And in those areas as well, we do see an uptick in violence. So there are parallels everywhere. And I think it's about connecting the dots a little bit more. But there are many researchers working on these issues and surfacing that data.
Thank you. I don't know if anyone would like to contribute anything else. Humberto?
Yes, please. And just building on the excellent points shared by Elodie. And Elodie, I know which research you're referencing. And I think it's important for us to share with the audience, because that report came to mind right away when this question popped up, which is the Never Until Now research report that was conducted by the Leanda Aboriginal Women's Society in BC, looking at the experiences of Indigenous women in those man camps, in the working camps of extractive companies in the Yukon and northern BC. So again, never until now by Leanne Aboriginal Women's Society, and I encourage all of you to read that. It is an eye opener in terms of making those connections between gender-based violence, harassment, in particular in the context of the workplace, mixed in with the racism and the impact of those industries on women's lives, in particular Indigenous women's lives. So I wanted to help to amplify that particular report because it's really worthy of consideration. Thank you so much.
Wonderful, thank you, Humberto. So I wanted to ask another question. We've already heard about the ways in which religious institutions have been part of the problem with regard to gender equality, and also how they can mobilize their communities to be part of the solution. So if we look deeper, are there any spiritual principles that religions share in common that may be helpful for addressing the problems we've talked about today? Andrea, would you like to?
Sure, but do you mind repeating the question?
Sure. If we look deeper, what are the spiritual principles that religions share in common that may be helpful for addressing the problems that we've spoken about today?
Well, I think from the Baha'i perspective, there's this beautiful teaching that I think is directly applicable to the discourse on the equality of women and men. And there's this idea that humanity has two wings of a bird. Each wing one is woman, the other one is men. And only when both wings are equally strong can progress be attained. And so I think that having this spiritual conviction brings a lot of energy and determination to realizing that equality between women and men, because you realize that both of our destinies are tied together. There's no way to progress without both wings being equally strong. And I think that teaching in some way or another is shared among the faiths of the world and in other spiritual teachings as well.
Thank you for sharing that. Elodie?
I think I mentioned it in my points, but the notions of equity and justice are actually embedded in most faiths. If you look clearly at them, and I believe in the Baha'i faith as well, there are two important tenets. So understanding, I think, how interconnected we are, like Andrea was saying, also emphasizes why we need equity and justice, and how we need to show up with a moral compass in everything that we do. And I think that is something spiritual groups and faiths have always emphasized, that we need a moral compass. We need to understand what responsibilities we have, not only to ourselves, to our families, but to our communities and the environments that we're in. And I think if we take a moment and reread some of the important texts of all religions, you will find those tenets emphasized there. The other one that I talked about is courage. That a lot of this work requires courage. It requires courage to stand up to systems that are unjust. It requires courage to stand up to how things have always been done. And we see that courage really demonstrated, particularly by women, because as I said, they often have children to fight for. And I think we should not underestimate how many men also have that courage and we want to see that happen. So I think, again, thinking about how oftentimes faith gives us courage, knowing that we have a faith to back us, a faith to strengthen our hearts and spirits. That is what can give us that little push to stand up against injustice. So again, I think that's something that is a common thread across many, many faiths. And I personally come from a multi-faith family. So my father and mother have different faiths. So we grew up bathed in both. And both of them carried similar messages. And again, the message of dialogue and empathy, also a common thread between all of them. So I think those are things we need to hang on to because they also give us hope.
Thank you, and thank you for that hopeful ending. And Humberto, would you like to add anything?
Just a couple of quick principles that I don't know if they're used within faith communities, but certainly they're important in our line of work. And the first one is do no harm, right? So as faith institutions and communities look to play a role in addressing this issue, it's really important to keep that principle in mind. Do no harm, exclude no one, bring everybody to the table. The other one, and it's one that is often advocated for by Indigenous communities, is nothing about us without us, which is involve those who are most impacted by these issues, bring them to the table, empower them, give them leadership positions, listen carefully, and support and stand beside and behind and advocate together with them. Nothing about us without us, and do no harm are two principles that I would really encourage faith communities to adopt, and also within Canada, within North America, and in many parts of the world. Visit the Truth and Reconciliation reports, visit the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's Call to Actions, and incorporate those principles, those calls to action into your own institutional actions and advocacy and principles as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Humberto, for your insights. So this has been a really illuminating conversation, and I feel like we could continue talking and learning with one another for a very long time. I do see that there are other questions in the chat, but unfortunately our time is coming to an end. But the good news is that this won't be the last time that we will gather to discuss more about these themes. So on behalf of the Office of Public Affairs, I'd like to thank our speakers, Elodie, Jacquet, Humberto Carolo, and Andrea Salguero. And I'd also like to thank you for all coming and spending time with us today. And lastly, I'd like to invite you to subscribe to our newsletter, the Office of Public Affairs newsletter, where you can hear about our future events and that are exploring these kinds of themes. So we have these types of conversations on an ongoing basis, and we really look forward to being in touch with you again. The link to the newsletter has been sent, it's been sent out in our chat box, I believe. I think so. And yes, again, sorry, I know there are more questions, but our time is short, but we're very grateful that you all were here with us today, and especially on Earth Day, an important day for us to gather and speak about these themes. So thank you very much for coming, everyone.